Hello everyone, I'm so pleased to have this opportunity to give you this talk. Many thanks to the organisers for their kind invitation. I really am so sorry that I can't be with you in person. The programme looks wonderful and I wish I could be with you to meet you and discuss together. However, hopefully you'll pick up some of my ideas from this presentation and that we'll be able to interact live during the Q&A session. Today, I'd like to consider how we can analyse communication challenges when they occur among people from culturally diverse backgrounds. So I start by briefly considering some of the challenges we face with nation-based conceptualizations. I then use a critical incident presented in a paper by Grosskopf and Barmeyer to explore two current approaches for dealing with the challenge. First, their multi-paradigmatic approach, and then my intercultural pragmatic approach. And then I end by reflecting on the insights that have emerged from this. Now, 25 years ago, William Goodekünst, who was a major figure in the intercultural communication area, published this diagram to show the interconnection between cultural values and communication. And certainly here we're talking about what I want to consider is communication and relationship management and the impact of culture. Now, many people have gone from cultural values directly to communication. But as you can see, he actually saw it as a more indirect route with cultural norms and rules having an impact, but then also individual socialization. So let's see how that pans out. Now, research by Ron Fisher and Shalom Schwartz found there was greater variation in values within countries than across countries, leading to fundamental questions about that whole national difference in values. And they also pointed out that there's a gap between values and behaviour in both directions. So, for example, if we took the value of being caring towards others, they would ask, well, how is care shown by a boss to an employee? Or the other way around, if a boss asks an employee a personal question, is that a sign of care? So they raised challenges or raised difficulties about going directly from national values to communication. So then we might ask, do norms fill the gap? So Alexander Thomas or Andy Malinsky, Erin Meyer, they all identify various different communication styles like high or low assertiveness, directness, indirectness, high-low formality, and they link these styles with national differences. But we could ask, do these really fill the gap? Now, on one hand, I'm going to give two examples on greetings. So, for example, there are conventions around how to greet. So in Hong Kong, for example, I was surprised when someone asked me, have you had lunch? Whereas actually, that was just a greeting, a bit like a lovely day, isn't it? And then on another occasion, I went to visit a Chinese family. This was in England, whom I knew really well. And as the wife opened the door, she looked at me and she said, "Oh, Helen, why are you wearing those terrible trousers?" And I was taken by surprise. I didn't think they were too bad, actually, myself. But why was she so direct and blunt when often we think of Chinese as being indirect? And here we see the importance of context, including the participants and the nature of their relationship. And my feeling is that this often gets overlooked in much of the theorizing. Erin Meyer, in a recent LinkedIn post, put this diagram saying we need to look culture in the eye. So my question would be, how do we do this? Where do we look? It's not clear to me where culture really is. And then if we go on and we think, yes, there's been a lot of emphasis on nationality, organization, but now we're where we all have these multiple cultural identities, all of which we're socialized into in different kinds of ways and to different extents, and they come out in different ways in different contexts. And so the situation is, in that sense, much more complicated. So this raises the question, well, whose norms and in what context? So let's move on now and think of this multi-paradigmatic approach that many people are suggesting now. And we're going to start with a case study by Groskop and Barmeyer. And they put forward three paradigms, potential paradigms: the positivist, where there's an objective and assumed to be an objective and independent reality sort of out there that we are trying to find and identify its impact. Then interpretivist, where it's believed that reality is socially constructed and the task is for us to understand the meaning of a phenomenon for the actors themselves. And then critical theorist, where it's also believed that social reality is constructed, but rather than just trying to interpret it, the aim is to change or improve it. Okay, so in their paper, these authors refer to this critical incident, a French-German critical incident. And this is what they write in the paper. A French controller, female, sent a French subsidiary's half-year figures to her colleagues in the German parent company for the preparation of the balance sheet for the entire group. A few days later, she received an email from a German colleague, male, written in German, and they put in the paper the English translation. Dear Miss Dupont, thank you very much for sending me the key figures. Unfortunately, the numbers you sent are wrong. Please check them again. Yours sincerely, Manfred Müller. Then they go on to say the French controller was irritated, a little bit angry. First, the figures were not wrong from her point of view. And secondly, the message seemed very rude to her. She felt her honour had been offended. She blocked her German colleague and did not answer. He waited and waited. No answer from France. Nevertheless, the consolidated balance sheet needed to be prepared. So the authors analyze this from different perspectives. So first, from a positive analytic perspective, they refer to values that, say, Hofstede put forward in terms of relationship orientation or ego orientation, soft management versus directive management. They think also of Hall and indirect communication, direct communication, with the German being much more direct, say, than the French. And then with Alexander Thomas, with fact-oriented versus relationship-oriented. And so one way of explaining that incident could be by drawing on these different values, which are said to be at a national level. Then they move on to an interpretive analytic perspective, where you're trying to see things from the participant's perspective. So say, well, what about Dupont? She might think, what does he mean by wrong? What way are my figures wrong? And why was he so blunt? And anyway, why did he email me in German? And then Muller's probably thinking, well, why hasn't she replied? Is she ill? Has she gone on holiday? Did she actually receive my email? Or is she refusing to respond? And they present a number of different ways in which that could be an interpretive approach could analyze those questions. And then they go on to the critical analytic perspective, where there's a challenge to power asymmetry, and the aim is to foster change. So thinking of Dupont, and I put lack of power, she's a member of a subsidiary company, female, and is told what is correct and incorrect. Yet in another way, she has some power because she possesses the information that Müller wants and needs. So she had power in that respect. And then Müller, he was a member of the parent company, male, controls what's correct and incorrect. So in that sense was more powerful. And yet he was also dependent on Dupont's response. So thinking about that approach, I agree each perspective can potentially offer helpful insights. But in my view, the positivist approach is certainly problematic on its own for some of the reasons we considered earlier. And at an individual level, the critical approach is often a bit impractical. At an individual level, you can't always fight the whole system, although as researchers we may do. And then there are many different interpretive approaches, and for practitioners, they can be vague and difficult to engage with or learn from, and it's unclear which to choose. So, for example, these authors, Gertsen and Zølner, say, many managers still tend to prefer normative models that appear to be easily translatable into general guidelines for action in all contexts, whereas interpretive research rather aspires to unpack complexities and nuances. The implication is also that interpretive studies mostly do not appear in the form practitioners generally expect science to have, and this may lead to the findings receiving a more skeptical reception. It follows from the above that the potentials and challenges of the interpretive perspective are closely intertwined with its complex notion of culture that requires more effort to communicate and comprehend. So, yes, that's one of the challenges for an interpretive approach. It is often quite complex, multiple sources, and it's not always clear which you should use. And some other thoughts I've had, it seems that the multi-paradigmatic approach in CCM seems to always focus on culture, and the role of individual agency is often overlooked or downplayed, including the possibility of problematic behavior on the part of the individual. I mean, was Müller actually working well from his company's perspective? We'll have a look at that a little bit later. So that would be one approach to dealing with the challenges of these nation-based models, would be to actually take a multi-paradigmatic approach. So now I'd like to introduce you to another perspective, one that comes from intercultural pragmatics, and more specifically, first introduce you to the TRIPS model, and then we'll revisit that case study to see how it could be analysed from the TRIPS perspective. First, though, when I say an intercultural pragmatic approach, well, what is pragmatics? It's a branch of linguistics that focuses on the construction of meaning in communication. So it is a sort of constructionist approach to linguistics. It argues that people actively construct meaning, drawing not only on the language code, but also on the context of the communication. And context is seen as having many facets, including the people involved and the settings in which the communication takes place. And a key focus of pragmatics has been on how language is used to manage relations. In other words, it has an interactional function as well as a transactional function. And this aspect of pragmatics is studied within a strand known as politeness theory. So the TRIPS model, and TRIPS is an acronym, at the centre, it would say, is interactions. In other words, what is said and done, or you could say what is not said and what is not done, because that can also be a problem. We then have reactions, both before, during, and after those interactions, as to what's been said and done. How we react, as well as what is said and done, is influenced by the people involved and their interconnections. It's also influenced by the settings, and we'll see a little later how those settings are multi-layered. And then, and this is probably the newest part of the model, there are triggers there are issues or sensitivities that can trigger the rapport reactions to what is said and done. So why did I develop the TRIPS framework? Well, it includes sociopragmatics, or the pragmatic perspective can be quite complicated. And so we've tried to include the key elements so that it becomes usable for non-specialists as well as specialists, providing you could call it like analytic pegs for the non-specialists, and it facilitates analysis at a greater depth for those who are interested and want to do so. So this concept of the triggers is the newest and the most practical component, but it has its foundation in interpersonal pragmatics. So just to say a little bit about that foundation. Now, in interpersonal psychology, stretching way back to the 1950s and going on in research right up to the present day, psychologists have identified two key dimensions for all relationships. On the one hand, we have a vertical one, control, and this is about level of autonomy versus control. So you've got high control versus low control. And the second dimension, the horizontal one, is to do with involvement or connection, and you have high connection at one end and low connection at the other end. And many psychologists would see these two dimensions as being core or fundamental to interpersonal interaction. More technically, it's called the interpersonal circumplex, and I've given a few references there. And as you can see, it stretched starting like from the 1950s right up to current work, especially in police interviewing and so on, where it is used as a very central concept. And I have drawn on this in my work. The triggers that we've got in the TRIPS framework also are based in interpersonal pragmatics within politeness theory, where there's been a lot of work for many generations almost on the factors that can cause people to be upset. So very originally with Brown and Levinson, or well before that with Goffman, and within Chinese culture, the notion of face. But then these other things, autonomy, again, coming up, rights and obligations, association, involvement, that's like the other, the horizontal dimension, equity, goals, cost benefit, reciprocity, ethics, lots of factors identified. If you want to follow up on that, again, I talk about, summarize them and discuss them in a paper this year published with Wang Jiayi. So let me go and explain these triggers now in the TRIPS in a little bit more detail. So 6 of them all together, and I call them the GAF TRIPS triggers, sorry, because of, again, their initials there. So the first one is the goals. If our goals are not met, we can get annoyed. Autonomy, and I've already talked about this, is a dimension ranging from high autonomy to low autonomy or control, and none of us like to be bossed around. On the other hand, sometimes we like some kind of direction and guidance, so we need to get the right level of autonomy. You then have attention. Again, none of us like to be completely ignored, but on the other hand, we don't like to be given too much attention. So again, getting that balance right. We don't want to be excluded. We want to be included very often, but we don't want to be just always picked on and chosen. Then you've got face, which I think many of you will be familiar with. We want enough respect and appreciation. Fairness, we want to be treated fairly, and we want to people to operate or manage with ethical principles. So 6 triggers, And if any of these are breached in some way from what we want, this can often cause some kind of rapport reaction. Now, what are the implications? People may prioritize the GAF rapport risk factors differently. For example, the relative importance of goal achievement versus autonomy. And people may also interpret one or more GAF rapport risk factors differently. For example, what counts as unfair? Your sense of fairness and unfairness may be different from my sense of unfairness and fairness. These differences are also likely to be more pronounced in global contexts. And so I would say everyone needs to be mindful towards their own and others' interpretations and prioritizations of the GAF rapport risk factors. And in my view, as we'll see in a moment, this is one of the mistakes that Müller made. Okay, now then let's move on and revisit that case study, think from a TRIPS perspective. Just to remind you, you had a French controller and a German colleague. The German colleague from the parent company wanted the key figures and sent this email translated into English. Unfortunately, the numbers you sent are wrong. Please check them again. And she was annoyed and angry and did not send the figures. So we could look at it, if we look at it from the GAF triggers perspective, the notion is that if there's alignment between participants' trigger concerns, then there's smooth rapport, but if there is no alignment, then the rapport will be disturbed. So if you think Müller wanted to obtain the correct figures, but we could also say that Dupont presumably also wanted to submit the correct figures. So in one sense, their goals initially were aligned. Then, however, from the wording and maybe other factors in Müller's email, Dupont's face was threatened, the competence of her ability to provide correct figures. She then didn't reply, and so you had Müller needing attention. He wanted Dupont's response and didn't get it. So we see the misalignment coming here because of the face. Then he didn't get the attention that he needed, and then their goals were not, neither's goals were fulfilled. So reactions, as we saw in the example, Dupont towards Müller, she was irritated, angry, offended. She evaluated him as rude. Müller's reactions, we don't have any evidence, it's not reported, but it's presumably he was confused, frustrated, probably evaluated Dupont as incompetent and irresponsible. Then, though, we need to go on and actually look at the interactions which could seem to have given rise more directly to those different triggers. And interactions, we've got four elements: the content and the speech act, what was actually said, the style, and then you've got the choice of the language code, and in many contexts you have the communication dynamics, like who speaks when, the turn taking. So when Müller sent Dupont that email, he was criticizing her, and in linguistics that would count as a face-threatening act, and that would be the case whatever one's cultural background. And in most contexts it needs to be mitigated in some kind of way, such as with face-supportive moves or downgrading of the mistake, and I'll explain a little more about that a little bit later. Then I also want to just make a comment on communication style and directness. It's often just used directness, indirectness, but in linguistics there are actually three aspects to it. Explicitness can be in the wording, how clear it is from the actual choice of the words and the grammar. But then you also have communicative strength, which means the impact of the context on that clarity. So if I said, this is 10 euros, you might wonder, why has she suddenly said this is 10 euros? But if I was in a shop and the shop assistant to me said, this is €10, I'd know she's meaning this is the price of the goods. And then we have the notion of bluntness, softness, because it's not only what's in what we call the head act of the criticism, but there may be words around it that help to make the message softer or stronger even. And that also can affect directness and indirectness. So then if we look at the wording that he used, you'll see that he said, the numbers you sent are wrong. Now, this is what we would call a head act, and he's very explicit and direct from that point of view. You notice here, though, that he's put unfortunately, and that we would count as a mitigator, and please is also a mitigator trying to soften them. But also thinking about the gaffe triggers, he didn't give any attention to face. He was just very explicit. And even though it said, unfortunately, it wasn't really much. But perhaps for me, the most important thing was the actual message content. He gave no explanation of what was wrong with Dupont's figures, and no explanation as to what he needed Dupont to do or how she needed to correct them. And so from this point of view, the goal achievement was thwarted. And to me, that's one of the most important factors that went wrong. There's also the question of language code. Why did he choose German rather than English? English was usually used, apparently, unless they knew that the other person was proficient in German. So did he know whether Dupont was comfortable in German? Had they communicated before? We haven't actually got any background information on that. Then I would also say there are also differences across languages, and it's nearly always best to analyse in the original language if at all possible. So, in fact, there are some slight differences, it seems to me, between the English version and the original German, as I understand it from Christoph Baumeier, sent me that. So perhaps the most noticeable is that the unfortunately, which has been put in English, doesn't seem to be in the original German, perhaps because there's that sort of automatic tendency to actually to downplay them a bit. Right, so we've looked at the interactions and those different aspects of that. Now we move on to the two main contextual factors, the people first and then the settings. So in terms of people, we always want to know how many there were, their personal characteristics, identities and skills that might have had an impact, their values, beliefs, expectations, roles and responsibilities. We needed to know that. Their connections, whether they were equal or unequal, how close or distant, and something about their interaction histories. So in this particular example, there were two people. Their roles and responsibilities, well, Müller wanted to collect, his responsibility was collect the data that was needed, and Dupont's responsibility was to supply that data. In terms of connections, one seemed to be superior, the other subordinate. They appeared not to be close. And in terms of values and beliefs, expectations, probably very similar. Dupont would expect that everyone should be treated respectfully, including herself. And Müller would expect that subsidiary staff will supply the data needed. In terms of personal characteristics and identity, skills, Dupont seems to be quite determined, willing to take a stand. Müller probably task-focused, but I would wonder whether he's an unskilled communicator. Certainly by not giving the information about how to complete the task or what was wrong showed that he was a bit unskilled. And interaction history, we don't know about that. We don't know whether maybe they've had some sort of problem before. Then if we think of the other major contextual factor, now we can see that I've put it at multi-level. So you have the actual interaction setting, the micro setting, then of course the organizational, societal, world setting. And I'm going to touch base on each of those. But particularly from a linguistic point of view, what's very important is the communicative event, because all communicative events have certain characteristics. So they have a purpose, they have procedures for carrying out an activity, there are the roles of the individuals involved, and there are the artifacts or the tools needed to carry out the activity, and then the physical or the social environment. So in this particular case, this is a micro setting, the communicative event. The purpose was to collect and collate data. Procedures, though, was there any special format for providing the data? Quite possibly. Roles, subsidiaries were to provide the data in a timely manner. The artifacts was email. The environment was online. And here, as I say, it seems to me what we don't know is, was there some particular format? Had Dupont not been told clearly enough about that? And of course, email, it's always more challenging to manage relationships by email than it is directly. Okay, so now we've had two different analyses of the same case study. So let's move into some further reflections. So reconsidering the positive perspective, we had claims in terms of the values. French and German are significantly different in these various respects. And to me, one of the major issues is that they are decontextualized generalizations. This is not to say that there are no bases to it at all, but as I say, directness, indirectness is more nuanced than often comes across in this sort of kind of work. And there were other factors also involved. Now, what about an interpretive perspective and these kinds of questions? Now, what comes across to me very clearly is that it seems neither of them were focusing on the other or taking a dual perspective. They were each looking at it from their own perspective. Muller didn't think, have I offended her, it seems. And so that, of course, is one of the really important things in the intercultural work, is to be able to see things from another perspective. So then you might ask, well, where is culture in TRIPS, in the framework that I've presented? And Shalom Schwartz actually talks about the press of culture. And so here I've got these diagrams coming in. So certainly culture coming from the multi-level settings, the micro, not just though the national or the professional or even the organizational, but what's often really missing in a lot of the intercultural work is the micro level setting, those norms and procedures at a micro level, at a communicative, what we call a communicative event. So at the heart, we've got interactions, we've got triggers, and we've got reactions. But I would say that the impact of culture is indirect, because it also is passing through the individuals concerned, their own values, beliefs, normative expectations. And if you remember back to the Gudekunst diagram, he also talked about that individual level and the individual people's socialization as well. So more specifically then, within the TRIPS framework, you've got settings where you've got those different norms and expectations for a given communicative activity. There's professional norms, organizational norms, societal norms, schemas and values, and they certainly have an impact, but as I said, I would see it as indirect onto the interactions. Why? Because also those do impact on the people. So culture can then, maybe with different perceptions of hierarchy, and often a very important one that can take place is the different perceptions of roles and responsibilities. So in other words, the cultural patterning can then affect the individual people's beliefs, but it's also got their own agency as well. You then, in terms of interaction, you have different communication styles, use of mitigation, the acceptability of explicit criticism, but those are also again affected by that communicative event, the type of norms and expectations, not just overall, but also in specific communication contexts. We've then got reactions, and sure, there are cultural differences in how acceptable it is to show, for example, your emotional reactions. But again, these would be partly by the national culture, professional setting, etc., but also individual personalities and so on. And then you would have the triggers, and those again can be impacted, as I explained earlier on, prioritization of which is more important, the goals or the face, but also things like different interpretations of what counts as fair and so on, which can come from national differences, but can also come from a range of other factors. Now, if we then return to the paradigmatic position, so where is TRIPS from that point of view? Now, my original assumption was that TRIPS was taking an interpretive approach because it would certainly be take a constructive or co-constructive, as we would say it, approach to meaning. But a highly influential sociolinguist, Janet Holmes, who's conducted a major research project in New Zealand over many years called Language in the Workplace, she looked especially at Pakeha and Maori interaction. And she refers to her paradigm being a realist or critical realist. And so I looked that up, and I felt that in many ways it captured the goals of a multi-paradigmatic approach, but does so somewhat differently. Now, I'm not an expert at all in this, but I want to just say a few words about critical realism. Its philosophy posits that there is an objective reality, but that our knowledge of it is imperfect and socially constructed. So it's always mediated through our perceptions and theories. It emphasizes the importance of understanding both structure and agency in social systems. And it maintains that social structures have real effects regardless of our awareness or understanding of them. So, while social structures constrain and enable human agency, individuals, though, can also influence and transform these structures over time. Critical realism then provides a middle ground between positivism and interpretivism, combining ontological realism with epistemological relativism, acknowledging both the existence of an objective reality along with the social nature of knowledge. So on this website, they represent it diagrammatically a bit like this. So we have ontological realism, epistemological relativity. There's an interplay between structure and agency. The focus on causal mechanisms, methodological pluralism, and explanatory critique. Now, as I say, I'm not an expert in this. I'm just beginning to follow up it more, but it seems to me that this actually does capture quite well sort of my sense of culture being that press of culture which is indirect and it exists out there, but it's mediated through people and their own interpretations and constructions. Then finally, a few practical tips, I would say, because one of my goals has always been to not only have something that academically makes sense, but also can be of relevance to practitioners, so we don't have the trouble that they would just go with the simplistic explanations. So I would say start with the triggers. They are the immediate source of the negative reaction, and they provide usable pegs to guide people's thinking and reflections. We've used that with our students, and they find it really helpful, and also with professionals, business people, really helpful for them to guide their thinking. It helps people make sense of their reactions and why their reactions may be different from that of others, without immediately trying to explain the why in the sense of, is it a cultural difference or what? Then you've got reactions. We do need to ask ourselves on this. We have emotional reactions, and it's very helpful for us to think those through. What am I experiencing? How intensely and how far am I and others displaying those emotions? How well can I perceive other people's emotions? And what evaluative reactions am I making? What judgments have I made of others? So the reactions here would be both emotional and evaluative, where, like Dupont felt that Miller was rude, and we often do make those judgments. And then why analyze reactions? It is important at a practical level to stop them festering, and emotional intelligence work shows that clarifying the emotions can in itself reduce their intensity. And understanding different people's perspectives can also help reduce our emotions. Then going back to using trips, start with the triggers. Think about the reactions, but then after that, if you wish, people can dig more deeply, thinking of the interactions of people and settings in the kind of way that I've talked about for professionals, or if you're analysts, there's lots of detail that you can go into drawing on work in intercultural pragmatics. Okay, just finally then a few words of opportunities for follow-up. If you want to know more about trips at a detailed level, we talk about it in our book, Making Working Relationships Work. And you can download a free copy of Chapter 1 from our website. For a professional application of the framework using a different case study, I've got an article just published in the Intercultural Journal where there was a special issue on embracing a relational paradigm. If you want a more sort of academic approach, there's an open access article that I wrote this year with Wang Jiayi, which is in the Journal of Pragmatics, and that's also, as I say, open access. Okay, so that's all that I want to say today. Hopefully we'll be able to manage the Q&A without any problem, but if you want to get in touch, do feel free to email me either at helen@globalpeopleconsulting.com or at my university address, helen.spencer-Oatey@warwick.ac.uk. Thank you very much for listening.